Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I am Andrea Rebecca. We are two friends, a therapist, and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief.
Good morning, Andrea.
Good morning, Rebecca.
How is your heart this morning?
My heart is a lot of things. As you know, I am leaving. Now it's tomorrow morning. I was going to leave tonight, but I can't do it. My shit is not together. But tomorrow morning, I'm leaving for a wilderness journey with Cheryl Slover-Lynette, who we had on an episode, into Canyon de Chelly, which is a canyon in the heart of Dene Land, which is Navajo Nation. So tomorrow morning, I'll drive to Chinle, Arizona. And then as part of this, I'm doing a 24-hour solo. And I'll be gone from my family for a week, which I've never, ever, ever done. And will not have a cell phone for 5 of those 7 days. So I have a lot of anxiety about the things I do around the house. And it's not like my husband can't do them, but I love to do them. And I love the balance that we have. And I'm really upsetting that balance. He is fine with it. This is all mine. My mom's going to come and help out with the boys for homeschool stuff. But yeah, I feel a lot of things. I feel excited. You sent me a message yesterday and you were like, I'm so proud of you for doing something that's so outside of your comfort zone. This is going to be amazing. And that was the balm that I needed. I was just like, oh my God, that's why I feel so anxious, because this is outside my comfort zone and this is a good thing. So my heart is a little frenetic, but it's okay.
Beautiful.
How is your heart this morning?
I mean, just listening to you, I'm bubbling with excitement for the journey you're going to go on. And I'm nervous for you.
Thank you.
My heart is so proud that you're doing this and I'm not. But yeah, right now, I feel like I had a really nice morning. It's been a while. I've had so much body stuff the past month. So I just feel like I get winded walking up the stairs now. There's just ways that I'm I want to be breathing right again. I want, everything to be in line. And so this morning I went out on a walk, which felt great. And yeah, so my heart feels good in this moment, just to be moving and to feel like my body's coming back online. And yeah, it's nothing like longing for health when you don't have it. So
totally.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. I can feel your energy has shifted as you've started to feel better, and I'm so glad. Well, this morning we have on a poet and author, Reese Zahner. Her mom was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when she was just 21. And through the following years, they went fast and slow. She was only 28 when her mother passed, and her mom only 66. Through the depths of her grief, she picked up her pencil and began to write about her mother, the journey of Alzheimer's that they took together, and the grief now that she walked in the world alone. There were so many things that she learned through this process, but what she kept hearing was that her mother was such a kind person, and she felt like it's such a beautiful legacy to leave behind. She hopes that through her work, she honors her mother's legacy by encouraging us to be kind to ourselves, and kind to each other. So Reese, welcome to All the Grief podcast.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning. How is your heart today, Reese?
Oh, my heart's wonderful. My heart feels so good. And so it's actually a really exciting day for me. I'm so excited to be able to share it with you. I just finished my book. So
wow.
I turned the Moving With album into a book, and it's been 3 years of doing it. And I finished it. This morning.
Oh my goodness.
I wrote the end of it yesterday. And then I put it all together in the exact right order this morning, and it feels so wonderful.
Beautiful.
I feel so it's all out. I feel like I've taken every single thing that I've learned, every single thing about my mom and me and the journey and my grief and where I am now and how I got there. And I put it into words and I put it in. And so now I'm just, it's absolutely astonishingly delightful to be in my heart right now.
Yes.
It's so full.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, we shine that back at you. That is such a beautiful accomplishment. We feel so
Mhm.
privileged to get to talk to so many authors, and I think have just come to understand what a huge lift it is to write a book and how fulfilling it feels when you are able to sort of just tie it all together. And I'm sure you'll be submitting it wherever you're submitting it to, and we'll have a book soon. That is so exciting, Reese.
Yeah, my grandmother, who is my mom's mom, she's my editor. She's editing. It's about
Oh,
10,000 words. She's editing
Mm.
all of it because she has an English degree, so a 6 years degree in
Oh,
English.
wow.
So she has actually more than a master's, and she taught English for 33 years in
oh,
Georgia. And so my 93-year-old grandmother right now is editing
oh,
my book that's about her daughter and about the journey of grief that we took, and she's editing it. And just, that's just also like such a wonderful thing for me,
oh.
is that my grandmother, who taught me how to write, encouraged my
Mm,
writing, taught me how to read, and she and my mom, and then my mom was an English major from the University of Georgia. And
wow.
so I feel like it's also my mom's writing, it's
Yeah.
it's this legacy of writing, but my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, is editing my book right now, the book that's about me and her daughter. And that's just really special to me.
That gave me goosebumps. That is so incredibly special. Wow.
Yeah. Mm, that's powerful.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Well, Reese, why don't you kind of take us back a little bit? We've started calling this like people's grief origin stories and sort of looking into your background a little bit. I feel like things like origin story might land for you.
I love a good origin story.
Mhm.
Right? So do we. But talk to us a little bit about how this journey began with you and with your mother and with your grief.
hmm So I'm the oldest daughter. My mom had me late. She wanted me very badly.
Mm,
And she had me, she was, I think, 38 when she had me. She had my sister at 42. She wanted us very badly. And so she got to be my mother. And I had the most wonderful mother. She's kind and gentle, and
mm,
she loves me fiercely. And when I was 21, she got diagnosed with early onset
Mm.
Alzheimer's. I was a junior in college. And I remember when it happened, and I didn't really understand what was going on, candidly. I was in an internship in Atlanta, and she got memory tests back at this point that said that it was likely that she was going to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I went into work the next day when I was an intern, and I just started crying. And they said, "What's going on?" And I said, "My mom got, we think that she has Alzheimer's." And they all understood because they were older. They're not too much older. They were in their late 20s, early 30s, but they understood what that meant.
mm,
And I didn't. And one of the thing that stuck with me is my boss said, she says, "Reese, you don't understand, but your life changed today."
Mm.
And I think that that's really the moment that I kind of look between before and after, is that sentence, "is your life changed today." She got officially diagnosed with the spinal tap when it was my midterms week. We got the results back. And I went to a very small college in the university called the University of North Georgia in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And I am so grateful for it, because that week I went to all my professors and I said, "My mom just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Can I push my test back?" And they all allowed me to do it, which is, I'm so
mm,
grateful for it. And then what I did is, I would never wish this on anybody. I would never wish it on my worst enemy, anything. I would never wish the conversations of having to tell your family that your mom has been diagnosed with
mm,
Alzheimer's. I told my family.
mm,
I had to tell my extended family. I had to tell everyone.
mm,
And I felt like it was my responsibility to do it somehow as her daughter, her eldest daughter. My sister was away in Thailand. And so I felt this responsibility to do it. And we went on this journey of losing her over time.
yeah.
So she got diagnosed in 2015, 2016. I had an internship in Texas, and I went out, and on my first week here at my internship, I met this wonderful boy who I accidentally fell in love with when I was out here. And he's my husband now. And so
Mm.
I went back to Atlanta. I had to finish up my school. I was a junior. I had to go back and finish up senior year. And I said, "Mom, I didn't want to leave her because I knew that she was going to get worse, and I didn't want to leave her." And she said, "Reese, you have to go. You have to go be with him. You have to go try." Because it wasn't certain that he was going to be my husband, but I fell in love with a
Mhm.
boy. And she's like, "You have to go." I think my mom, that was one of the greatest gifts she ever gave me, is the freedom to go and to live my life in the wake and in the shadow of this disease that was happening.
Yeah.
And then when I was 28 on Halloween, my mother passed away suddenly. She was supposed to have 2 more years of life expectancy. I hadn't seen her. COVID took her away from me. And so I hadn't seen her since COVID. So I was going to go see her, and then COVID happened. So we were going to move her out to Texas to be with me so I could be closer to her and I could go and take care of her. I had the whole house picked out, this memory care facility. I did all this work for it. That was in March. She was supposed to come out in April. And COVID happened. We couldn't move her. And so I never saw her again.
Oh.
Yeah. And then I went into deep isolation. I was completely astounded by grief and astonished by it because I thought I knew it. I thought I had been through this thing of I had known grief, anticipatory grief. I had lost her for so long. I had been grieving for about 6 years at this point in my own way. And so I thought that when losing her that I would be prepared for it. But I wasn't prepared for it, was that I was not prepared. I wasn't prepared for the fact of there's a difference between having her somewhere, knowing that she's physically in this world breathing and knowing that she's not. And I had to deal with a completely different kind of grief, which was sudden grief, but also the grief that she wasn't here anymore. And I went into deep isolation and I just began to write. It was the only thing that made me feel better was writing. And so I wrote, and I wrote for myself. I wrote to be accurate to myself and my emotions, and I never intended it to be released. I wrote for about 6 months, and it was the only way that I could communicate to the outside world what was going on in my body, because I would write about what it was like to be in my body. And so my friends and family would call and they would say, "How are you?" And I'd say, "This is what it's like to be in my body." And I would read them a poem. I don't know if they understood, but that was the only way I could explain and express how I actually am doing, because I wanted to be honest. And then I put down my pen, I re-entered the world. And then back in December, which would have been 2023, time's wonky, 2023, I got inspired by songwriting and I picked up my pen again and I started to write. And then I went to a mentorship session with a renowned songwriter or a renowned producer in Nashville. And he's like, "You're amazing. I'll produce you." And I was like, "This isn't on my 2024 bingo card. What do you mean I'm amazing? I'm just coming here for mentorship. What are you talking about?" And he's like, "No, you're really good." And I was like, "What?" And he's like, "I'll produce you." I'm like, "What?" But I thought about it and I realized that if I had the opportunity to tell the story about me and my mom, that I wanted to do it. And so I took all my fear that I'm not good enough and all my fear that no one will understand and it won't mean anything to anyone. And I, shoved it to the side and I said it, shh. I said shh to the fear. And then I just did it and then I released it. And then it's been one of the most joyous, wonderful things that's ever happened to me in my life is having this experience. And now I have a book that I just finished, and I get to talk about mom and me, and I get to connect to other people who experience and know kind of what that's like and talk about grief openly and honestly. Because what I hope to do with my art, what I hope to do with having these conversations, what I hope to do with my experience is to help people not feel so alone in their grief. And I feel like if I can help to do that, then that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
And that's me.
Yes. And so had you written before? Had you written poetry?
No, I was a marketing major. I'm a damn good research paper writer. Grandma, through pure force of will, basically shaped and molded me into a research paper writer because I was not a good writer. I went into freshman English class. My sweet, very, very, very patient English teacher, Miss Steele, one of the best things that ever happened to me. She was very hard, but she was fair. And she encouraged me, and my grandmother, because she is an English teacher for 33 years and has more than a master's in English, they taught me how to write in a year. They taught me how to write, but it was a laborious process. We're talking like the Odyssey, basically here, there, or like Lord of the Rings, there and back again. Because what we would do is I would write a research paper. It would be awful. Then I would send it to grandma. Grandma would redline it. She would call me over the phone. Then I would do the edits, and I'd go to Miss Steele, and then I would go to her, and then she would edit the edits that my grandma gave. And then I'd go back to my grandma with the edits that Mike Steele made to her edits. And then we would do this 5 times. And then I would turn in a paper. And I did this every paper for an entire year for every paper I ever wrote. Wow. And at the end of 4 years, I became really good at research paper writing. I never wrote creatively though, but I never took a creative writing class. And so it was the only reason I came into it is because it's the only thing that made me feel better. It was like this weird experiment that I was doing. And I was like, nothing else is helping. Everything else makes me feel bad. This makes me feel a little bit better. So I'm just going to keep doing this thing. Yes. And that's kind of how I got into writing.
Wow. Yeah. And what a beautiful touch point for everyone to think about. Going back, I'm curious, before your mother's formal diagnosis, had you all had questions? Had you seen things or noticed changes in your mother?
Yeah, we did. My mom went through a really bad divorce with my dad. And so we thought it was the stress of the divorce
Sure.
that she was missing things. So we really didn't catch up on it, what was happening, until the divorce, calmed down and she still was forgetting things. Her father had Alzheimer's, but he had it at, in 70, 80s. So it was really, we knew that it was in the family. We knew that we maybe had the genetic propensity for it, but not this early.
Sure.
We never had seen it this early. We got her tested, not with no seriousness. We got her tested as if like, oh, we'll just go and we'll see, try it out. We weren't testing her with any real thought or implication that it could actually be this. It was like, oh, it was just one of these other tests. It could have been easily as anything else. It just came back that her memory scores were incredibly low. And they're like, well, they're so low that it might be Alzheimer's. And that's when everything shifted.
Sure.
That's what the day that I kind of, if I can mark a day in my life, it's the day that we got her memory scores back. And that's the day that we knew something was very wrong. But we had it was like this, it wasn't in our family to have Alzheimer's, but not this early.
Sure.
Yeah. So we knew, we saw something, but we thought, not this. It never crossed our mind that it could be this. And it was.
Yeah. So you didn't have the anticipation of like, oh my gosh, this is coming at us. It just kind of totally took you by surprise.
Yeah, she was so young. I mean, when she got diagnosed, she was 60.
Yeah, so young. And your sister, you said, was living in Thailand, and I imagine at 21 you were off at school. So were you trying to kind of like support or check in with your mom and understand all of this while not being at home?
Yeah. So my school was an hour away.
Okay.
And for that semester, when she got diagnosed, so we found out the memory tests were in summer. I extended my internship. I was in Atlanta. I extended it for that fall. I dropped my courses down from 5 to 4. So I had an internship and 4 lowered classes. And every day I would drive from my house in where I was staying in college, an hour to Atlanta. Then I would go and spend the night with her. Then I would go to my internship. Then I would drive back to college, an hour away, to go to my international affairs class. Then I would sleep. Then I would get up, do my other classes, finish those classes, drive back to Atlanta to be with my mom. And I would do this every week, every day.
Wow.
And I would also go, and we have an amazing memory care center in Atlanta. It's called the Emory Memory Care Center or something along the lines of that. But they gave out an entire class about memory care and about what Alzheimer's was. And so on top of going to classes in college, I also was going to Alzheimer's classes with my mom. So you could bring like one other person to go into these classes. And so my mom was learning about her diagnosis, and I was learning about her diagnosis with her at this hospital, on top of doing an internship, on top of doing 4 classes at college and being with my mom. And so I did that every day for an entire semester. And then I that's how I ended up in Texas, where I am now, is I got an internship with Southwest Airlines as a marketing internship. And mom was like, you have to go. And I was like, Mom, I don't want to go. And she's like, you have to go. And then, of course, life has a way of happening. The first date I went on when I was out here was with my husband, my future husband. And that kind of sealed the deal for me. And then all senior year, because I was a junior when we met, my husband and I. And so we did long distance for a year. I had to go finish up college. Most people, I think my age, who would be a senior, would be partying and living up life, or maybe, going and, talking down about freshmen or something. I don't know what people did. I went to a small college, so I had a kind of different experience. But every weekend I went back to spend time with my mom. Every weekend for the entire year, I was in Atlanta with my mom, and we would just sit and watch Perry Mason and just talk. And it was like, because I knew that I didn't have the time. I knew that I wanted to go out and be with my husband, this boy that I fell in love with, my future husband at the time. Yeah, I didn't know that, but I wanted to be with this boy. I only had a year to be with her. And so it was like this year where that was all I did every weekend. It's not that I didn't have a life, but my entire priority shifted from what a college student was doing. It was senior year to being with my mom and spending time with my mom and doing a full load of classes.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I imagine that was a pretty stressful time to be starting a relationship. So probably speaks volumes to your relationship because he could sit with you in that there was something of your heart that you were able to stay open to love as this primary relationship in your life was changing. I'm struck by the timing of.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. My husband is the most wonderful person in the entire world. I adore my husband. We've been together for 9 years. We've been married for 5. Our wedding anniversary, 5th-year wedding anniversary was last week. It takes a very special kind of person because I told him in the first month. And I felt like it was this thing that I was keeping. It was like this secret because I knew that I wanted him so badly to like me. And he did like me, but I was like, you don't know all of it. And I felt like I was hiding something from him. And I told him, and he's just the most wonderful person. And he accepted it. And he's like, how can I help? And he was so supportive. And my mom, it was so impactful to me as my mom, she was still cognizant at this point. She knew who I was. That later on didn't happen. But at this point, she still was able to ask about me. But she started to ask about Kevin, my husband. And so her questions would be, how Lainey, my sister, how are you? And how's Kevin? So he became like a part of our conversation. He was the only boy I ever took home to any of my family to meet. I remember the first conversation. He's like, hi, Miss Zahner. And, just was so lovely with her and was so patient with her when she would sometimes ask the same question over and over and over again. And it was just, I'm choking up because I'm so grateful for my husband, because it really takes a special kind of person to be able to go and to be so patient and kind with someone who has Alzheimer's. And that was not expected of him, but he did it anyway because he loved me and he's a good person.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. The universe, you said it earlier when you said life kind of has a way, like, you were supposed to be in Texas. That was supposed to be the moment. And just somebody to be there for you and to be able to have that connection that your mom was able to meet him when she was still cognizant and could know who he was and what he meant to your life. So what a beautiful gift. As you went through these classes with your mom, and as you said at the beginning, when you heard this diagnosis, you didn't quite understand what it meant. At 21, you don't have other friends who have parents who are going through this, and maybe not even grandparents at that point who are going through this, although you had witnessed your grandfather. So I can imagine you didn't, just sort of like not understanding even the weight of what was coming for you. But as you went through these classes and learned about it alongside with your mom, you talked about that anticipatory grief. How did you kind of take that in and metabolize what was going on for you as you were learning more and more about the disease and where you all were headed?
It's a good question. I think also I love questions. So thank you for asking very good ones because I love it very much. I think how I metastasized it, I realized the finiteness of things. I think I didn't want to, but I did. And I realized that there would be a day where she doesn't say my name again. I knew that day was coming. And every day when we would get off the phone, I would say, is it today? And she would say, bye, Reese. And I'd say, so it's not today. And eventually there was a day when I said, today's the day. She didn't say my name. I recognized the finiteness of things. I recognized that literally every day was the best day I was going to have with her because it's degenerative. And so I learned how to swallow her, how to bathe in her, a way that I never knew how to be fully present in my life. And I learned how to be fully present because I had to be, because she was going. And I knew that I wanted to look back on these times. I was like, in the moment, creating memories that I knew that I needed to create. I was building a foundation for myself that I knew I would have to come back to because I knew that I was going to have memories. There were going to be times ahead. It was going to be really hard and we weren't there yet. So I would go and I would say, I have to take all of this in. I have to remember these because these are the memories I'm going to have to be able to come back to when it's really hard. And so it felt as if I was preparing my own funeral.
Yeah.
I was putting myself in the grave. I was digging my own grave and I was knowing I was going to lie down in it. And I was like, but today's not the day I'm lying down in it. And eventually there was a day where I said, okay, this is the day. It's like knowing and feeling slowly that your relationship is dying. It's not even the person it's your relationship. And then what I learned to do, not with grace, I fought it. I want to be very clear with that because I think that there's a lot of this time where people go and they say, oh, I did it with grace. I'm like, well, I don't know who you are. I'm so glad you were able to do it with grace. That's great for you. I fought it and kicking and screaming. I learned how to be okay with being a nice lady. I learned that she didn't know who I was. And I would have to sit there as her daughter and know that she loves me. She just doesn't have no idea that that's me. And I became a nice lady. And I feel that's how I could love her, is be someone that she feels safe with, and that she feels listens to her, and that she feels respects her, and I became okay with this new identity over time that shifted. And it's not what I ever wanted, but I realized that that's how I can love her. And it took a lot of learning. There was a lot of learning. There was a lot of hard times. I think one of the things I look back on it, it's not in the book, but I'll talk about it. One of the biggest, a huge conversation, huge, momentous, life-defining arguments we ever got into was when we had to take her keys away because she wanted to drive. She always had the ability to drive. She wanted to drive, and she was a liability. And we said, we can't let you drive because you might, hit someone. And then you would be a liability. You might hurt someone. My mother was so gentle, but she would forget that she had her keys taken away. So then she would go looking for her keys, and then she would forget that her keys were taken away. And then she'd say, where are my keys? And we would have to have the same argument for weeks about her keys until she forgot that she even had keys.
Yeah. There's something you're saying as you were sharing this that feels important to talk about, which is I actually really appreciate you naming that you didn't feel grace. And it feels like there was this both and. And so I just want to check in if this feels accurate to you as I'm listening, but that reconciling, okay, I'm going to be a nice lady. I'm going to be with what's happening here. I'm going to soak her in. That there also was maybe a private world that you were having, not this feeling of acceptance or this sense of, oh, I'm okay with just being a nice lady, that there were kind of both were happening simultaneously.
Yeah, I think I talk about grace. I've talked about grace in other podcasts before, and I want to be clear about this. Because what I say is that the best thing I could ever do and learned how to do is give myself grace. But I did not give myself grace at the beginning. I gave everyone else grace around me for dealing with my mom. It was so much easier for me to give them grace than to give myself grace. And when I say grace, what I mean is understanding that I'm going through something really hard and I'm doing the best I know how to do in a situation that I have no freaking idea what I'm doing. And I gave everyone else grace for them going through a really hard time, not knowing what they were doing. And I judged myself so harshly because I'm a recovering perfectionist. And so I wanted to do everything perfect for her. I wanted to be the perfect daughter. And every time I wasn't the perfect daughter, it's hard. It's hard. I think that's something, I just always want to talk about the hard because I feel like it's something that people don't talk about a lot. Is there was one time we were going up, I was getting ready to go meet my husband's family the first time. And as a recovering perfectionist, I wanted to be perfect, right? And so I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to have all my outfits planned. And we had a fashion show, and it was my aunt and my mom.
I love
And
it.
my mom kept asking the same questions though. And I got real, and she goes, when are you going up? And she get her calendar. My mom was trying to do all these things to kind of keep order in her life, but she didn't have the capacity to have order. So she was trying to, and I got so frustrated with her. I said, Mom, I can't do this anymore. I need you to stop. And I got so frustrated with her. And I went back to her and I said, Mom, I'm so sorry. And she goes, I know, I forgive you. And so my mom gave me grace when I couldn't give it to myself.
Yeah.
And I learned over time how to give it to myself the way that my mom gave it to me. But yeah, I went kicking and screaming into this disease.
Yeah.
And I felt anger.
Yes.
I wrote in a poem one time that, why must I suffer? Why must I weep while others' mothers they can keep? There's real anger around that because everyone else had their mom and I was losing her. And I was the only one I knew that was doing it in this way, in this fashion.
Yeah.
And I was losing her mind. I think that's the other thing. If people my age had lost someone, it was with cancer typically, which is horrible. And I felt a real guilt around the fact that I wish my mother had cancer because I would be losing her body, not her mind.
Yeah.
And I was losing her spirit and her soul and her mind. And I wanted so desperately just to lose her body.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do it. It was outside of my control. And I felt guilt around that. I felt guilt around wanting her to die in a different way for my benefit, And I felt guilt around the fact that I was angry that I was jealous of other daughters and other mothers because I was angry that other daughters had their moms, or at least they didn't lose them in the same way that I was losing them.
Yeah.
And I felt jealous and angry. And I don't think I've ever really explained that before. So this is actually really helpful for me to kind of, process this. But yeah, I felt jealous and I felt angry around others' mothers. And I went kicking and screaming into this. And then I surrendered. I think that's the big thing that I learned in my grief journey is eventually the way that I have peace and acceptance, which I do now, is I learned the power of surrendering. Mm-hmm. But it's a very difficult, very hard lesson. And I struggle with it. Even to this day, I surrender, but I struggle with keeping surrender. I think surrender is not a passive verb. It's an active verb. It's not a verb that is, I surrendered. Yeah. It's, I surrender. Yeah. It's active. So I still struggle with surrender, but I try.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important. And I'm guessing you at some point did extend the grace to yourself around that. But then I'm hoping you had support around you that you could voice the feelings that you were feeling, because it makes so much sense as you're saying it. It's such a different thing to lose a mind than to lose a body, because you're losing the relationship while the physical relationship is still there. You're not having the same emotional relationship, the same connection. So I think that that's really what struck me even in your poetry, is voicing the things that you felt so honestly and vulnerably. Yeah. It's how you move with it, like the moving with instead of just through. And it was just a powerful piece. So it makes sense that you felt what you felt. I think we can get to surrender when we really let ourselves feel it. I think when we say, I'm bad and I shouldn't, and I'm not going to voice that, we keep not feeling completely in connection with what's happening because we're not able to be real. So
I think what you're saying is, what I hear is that when I relinquish shame.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's when I was able to surrender.
That's beautiful. It reminds me too, my father's mother died from Alzheimer's, and I remember when she forgot him. When she forgot me, it was so different, right? She was much older, and I sort of knew where it was going to go. I was prepared. I remember the last day that she remembered who I was, but I remember the day she forgot him, and I remember seeing the heartbreak on his face, because I think there's something about a parent-child, right? Like, you're always going to be their baby. Mm-hmm. And that bond will never be broken. And you watch and like emotionally, like, there's a heart bond there, that is a soul bond there that will always be there. But to see that vocal piece disintegrate is it's such a particular pain. There are so many things about different ways that people leave this world. And I think there's something just particularly unfair about Alzheimer's and having your parent forget you, in that way. I know probably from this side, you talked about her earlier using the present tense. Like, I know you feel her surrounding you and loving you. But I imagine in that moment, just the utter heartbreak of like, today was the day that my mom didn't remember me. So I also just want to extend my own appreciation for your honesty around that, because you're right. People don't talk about the hard part. People talk about the sacrifices that they made willingly or unwillingly to be there for their parent who was suffering. And along with all of it is anger and confusion and the question why. And we are human. We can't help but sometimes say, like, why me? Not that we wish it for anyone else, but just like, why do I have to have this experience? Why would anybody have to have this experience? So I just want to, echo Rebecca in saying that that's such a tender and vulnerable piece of your journey to share.
I think it's important to share it because it's isolating.
Yeah.
I think that's why I share it. It's because I realized how isolating it was for me. But I think what I realized in grief, and I wrote it, can I actually read you something from the book? Because I'm much better with writing. I'm an okay talker. I'm pretty well versed in talking.
Yeah, you're doing well.
Thanks.
But yes, but I get it. You've honed your words. So yes, let's hear them.
So this is what I learned in grief. It has been one of those days that are not so rare anymore. When I was a teenager, I had many of these kinds of days. The days when the whole world seems to be against you, when even nature seems to reject and rebuke you. Candidly, I'm in a bit of a mood. Surprisingly, I'm still capable of having moods. That's the most surprising thing I've learned about grief. I thought grief would be all gray, On reflection, I think I confuse the gray feeling of depression with what grief actually is. On some days, grief it feels gray, but on other days, grief feels light gray. The next day, grief feels dark gray. Then there can be a series of days when I feel blue, red, every color, and none of the colors. Grief is a kaleidoscope of feelings that don't easily fit into my, quote, word boxes of anger, sad, bitter, hard. Because surprisingly, there is joy in grief. The joy I feel in camaraderie with my friends, family, and acquaintances who have shared their grief stories with me. I am warmed and comforted by their generosity of spirit, their willingness to share their innermost emotions with me. I feel gratitude for the acts of love and service represented by the food my friends and family sent me after Mom died. I feel their love toward me. I am thankful when I reciprocate it to them when I have the capacity to do so. No, grief isn't gray at all. It's so much more painful, so much more beautiful than I ever thought possible. It's the most human thing I've ever experienced. It connects me to my humanity and the humanity of others. It connects me to other humans, both friends and strangers, who know what it's like in their own way to be where I am, to know the journey I walk alone, but one they have traveled before. I'm alone in my grief, but I know I'm not grieving alone. What a comforting thought.
I look forward to reading your book.
Same.
You have to let us know when it's out.
Yeah, please.
So this idea, I mean, in your grief and in your isolation, you start writing, you write poetry. It's just for yourself. It's cathartic. There's something moving for you. At what point did you decide I'd like to share this with someone? And who did you share it with first?
My grandmother.
Mm.
She was surprised and proud. Because remember, this is the grandmother that saw me and worked with me when I couldn't write worth a flip. You know, that basically, like Michelangelo's David, sculpted me into a research writer. And I came with her and I, wrote and I read her some of the stuff that I was writing. And she was so pleased. I think she was proud and pleased. And she was surprised and delighted that I actually could write. I think she was like, what? We were all surprised and delighted. We were confused because we're like, what is this? Isn't what? So I think she was delighted that there was a writer in the family. My Uncle Mike is a writer, but my Uncle Mike is married to my Aunt Karen. So my aunt and my Karen and my mom are sisters. So he's not a blood writer in the same way that it's like my grandmother now is like, I have begot a writer. So I think that there was like a little bit of excitement with her, which is kind of a weird thing to say. I mean, you'd have to ask my grandma, but it was heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to also hear how much pain I was in. So there was the heartbreak of it, of the honor, the vulnerability of it, because the thing is that like, it's hard. And I said, Grandma, this is hard to hear. And she said, I know, but I want to hear it. And so that's how I shared it with my grandma. And then eventually I would share it with friends and family. I'd only share it with people that I trusted though, because I think that the people I figured out who were safe in grief, there are some people that mean well who are not safe.
Yeah.
And I think the people that are not safe are the people that want to fix you.
Yes.
That's one of the things that I realized. I figured out who was there to support and to listen and who was there to fix me. And I appreciated their intention, which I think was good. They wanted me to feel better. They were intending to be helpful, but their execution of it was not helpful for me. It was a detriment. So I found the people who just wanted to listen and support and to let me take my time. And I shared with the safe people. And then that's how I kind of started to share at the very beginning.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's so important to name. And part of why we do this podcast is around just kind of grief literacy for people, and that the helping and fixing, it's actually not helpful and you're not fixing anything. And it can feel disconnecting. And so I hear you naming, like, you can see their intentions, but sometimes that's a lot of work to do in grief. And so what gets communicated more is like, you're uncomfortable. I'm doing something wrong. You want me to stop feeling what I'm feeling. And then it just creates a divide. And to that sort of idea, in one of your poems, you were talking about the books, all the grief books that were there. And I feel like it was such an important and beautiful being, like, nothing will resurrect her. God, that's so important. And I think there's a moment where books become accessible. I think it's probably more than a year after you have lost someone that it's like, okay, now I can read a grief book. And now you wrote a book. So like, when did grief books start to become accessible to you, and then writing the book? Because there's an intention to not have people feel alone. Like, I hear both and.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I want to be very clear. What I was angry at was not the grief books. It was the externalization of going external to fix my grief. And they were a representation. I think, and I misunderstood and I misconstrued because I was this is like, Mom died on Halloween. I went the next day and ordered every grief book because I was like, okay, I guess I do this now. We're going to inject every grief book. I listened to all the anthropological videos about grief. I learned everything because what I was using was my defense. My best defense is my intellect. I was intellectualizing grief. And the shift came when I felt grief instead of intellectualized it. Once again, I went kicking and screaming into that one. When I wrote the grief book, I wrote it very specifically because what I want is to be as honest as humanly possible about what grief actually is. And I did not hold back punches. I mean, there's things in there where I'm like, I put it in because I know that I wanted to say, is this normal? And I wanted to put in things that I thought were abnormal to me. I mean, I was diagnosed with like complex or complicated grief, with this idea that like I couldn't move on. It was like it wasn't just grieving. I was grieving, and to make it harder on myself, I was complicated or complex grief. I forgot the exact diagnosis of it, but I felt tied to her grief. If I was grieving, then I was remembering her. Like I was respecting her. Like I was, and I feel like, and they're like, no, that's not how you grieve. That's not good. And I was like, I see this intellectually, but it feels wrong. So I'm just going to, do it. But I think that with the book, I wrote it because I wrote it for the hope that someone can go and say, someone else did it. Someone else thinks these thoughts. Someone else went and said the thing that I don't know how to say out loud. Someone else is saying and feels and has been there before, because I felt like no one had been there before me. And I read these grief books, and what I was interpreting was that they were trying to fix me rather than probably what the intent was behind them, which is to not make someone feel so isolated and alone. But I wasn't ready to receive that, to your point. I can't control how people take it. I can't control how they receive it. All I can control is the intent behind it, which is to write in such a way that I am so open and honest about what went through my mind. And I delved so deep in mind myself to such an extent that someone else may be able to go, well, me too.
Yeah.
And they won't feel, hopefully, shame around that one thing and feel isolated in this thing where they go, no one else could feel that. And I'm like, well, I felt that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Here you go. It's in a book.
It's an offering.
Yeah. Every grief journey is individualistic, and no one's going to go on the same grief journey, but there are commonalities between all of them. And the other thing is that all you can do is hope to ease the path that someone is on. I think the best you can do is hope to ease it. You can't walk it for them. You can't really fix anything. There's nothing to fix, but you can hopefully ease the path. And I think the way that I wanted to ease the path is by saying you're not alone. I can put words into emotions, and then by reading the emotions and understanding the words, then maybe there's an able to be understood and to remove shame around certain things that I think a lot of people that are grieving go through and feel shame around. That I think that, and by removing shame, that allows for maybe the potential for some healing to occur.
Yeah.
That's all outside of my control. But that's what the book was written in, to try to remove isolation from very isolating thought processes that go in grief.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it was Brene Brown. She's a shame researcher, and a lot about shame reduction, of sort of hearing other people saying, no, I actually have had those thoughts too. I actually have those feelings too. It's the power of groups. It's people actually sharing vulnerably their stories, and other people being able to relate and say, oh my gosh, thank you for naming that. So I hear your intention, and I do imagine there will be a lot of people who actually can receive that and will receive that from what you're writing.
I think also is the messiness of grief. I intentionally put the book where it's not linear, where at least the linear part is not in the deep of it. You go and you're like, oh, she's okay. And then so the way that I put it, like I wrote that, right? This little thing about, oh, what a wonderful thought. And then I went immediately into talking about how I became dependent on alcohol, right? Like I started to, and I was like, so you're like, oh, okay. So wait, but I wanted that feeling, the messiness. I wanted to put into words the messiness and the non-linearity of grief, because I feel like it's not linear. I thought it was before going into grief. I was like, oh, you go have a nice bell curve. We're going to have a 3X structure. Like they taught me in English class. We're going to have the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then we're going to be fine. And then I was in grief and I'm like,
how many climaxes are there in
what?
this grief? Like how many apex?
Yeah. Like how can what is it? And so like I wanted to, in the book, what I did is I put it in such a way that I wanted to emotionally put people like into like, however I would try to drive a stick shift, which is not well. I have no clue how to drive a stick shift, but what I see in television shows is that they're like, I put the clutch in. I don't know what a clutch is. And they're like, I put the clutch in wrong. And now I can't go and it's all going down a hill and I'm starting and stopping. And I'm like, that's what I wanted. Cause that's how I felt in grief is I was like, I felt like I was taking 2 steps forward and then I'd take 3 steps back. Then I would jump forward and then I would go left. And then, it was like, I wanted that feeling of that inconsistency in the reading of it, because that's what it feels like for me to be in grief, is it was not linear. And it's jarring. I wanted that jarring. And I talked about like also my relationship with my husband, as you can tell probably from this conversation, is that like, I love my husband. I think he's amazing. It was so difficult on my marriage for when I was grieving. And I talked about it because I feel like that's probably not isolated to me. And we're a happy couple. And we almost reached breaking points where I was like, get away from me. And I talked about that. But I wanted to, because I feel like I hadn't heard that and I hadn't seen that represented. And the fact of, and that's me being in a happy marriage and how it just not destroyed it, but like, I'm so much better with poems than I am with actually talking. And what I said is, we're Pangea reduced to 2 islands.
Yeah.
We were once connected. Grief pushes my island away. Loss of affection keeps him trailing behind me. I resent him for the crumbs of affection he asked me to regurgitate, leaving nothing for myself. He needed something from me, and I wasn't able to give it to him. And I resented the fact that he was asking me for love that I needed for myself. But he also was right in needing it for him, but I couldn't provide that. And so our marriage really suffered. I talked to him about this. I feel like it helps not feeling so isolated in it, because I'm like, are we the only ones? And I imagine we're not. And I understand that there were just needs that he had that I couldn't, meet, such as love and attention and affection that I couldn't. I had to fill my cup up first before I could fill up his. And my cup I had no water coming in.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like such a unique contribution to the writing on grief. I've read a lot of grief books, and I know grief is a nonlinear process, but I think sometimes people just organize a book in such a linear way that it's when you're reading about it, it can feel linear, even if they say it's nonlinear. So it sounds like this really unique contribution you've put out there to say, I actually want you to read this book and feel, oh, she's doing great. Whoa. Like something just, that's the reality. And I look forward to reading it.
We're probably going to have to wrap pretty quickly here, but I did want to talk about the poetry. So someone reached out to us and said, here's where you can find Reese's poetry album. And I was totally prepared for just you reading us your own poetry, but it's got music behind it. And it felt almost like, honestly, I had this moment, I think both of us re-listened to it again this morning before the call. I had this moment of like, this is like a one-woman play even. Like it feels so immersive. And so just tell us a little bit about going from poetry into music and the story that you tell on this poetry album.
It was my producer that came up with the idea to put it to music. I'm not musically inclined. I can't sing worth a flip. So also, I just want to say I'm reciting the poetry for everyone's benefit, because otherwise, I don't know if you can demonetize like an album, but I would be owing people. Yeah, exactly. No, so I'm reciting it, but it is put to music. So my producer figured out what the musicians would sound like. The only thing I wanted is to have a clarinet on it. And that's because my mother played clarinet. I wanted her musical instrument on it. And so that's the only request I had. I said, if we're doing music, I want to have a clarinet. So the story, and I put it in such a way that you go through having my mother, losing her, the grief that follows, and the peace and acceptance that I have now in 14 tracks. The reason I wanted to do the book is to explain those because I could only do so much, right?
Sure.
But I think that what I wanted to do was understand, because when I was in grief and I could never understand how someone could go from the depths of anger and disillusionment with God to having peace and acceptance. And what I hope that the album did, and the reason I arranged it in such a way, is I wanted to emotionally explain how one person could do that from an emotional standpoint, how they could go from depths of anger and grief, and then it becomes kind of softer over time. And the emotions change until there is peace and acceptance. And it's to music that was all done improv by jazz musicians. So, I was like, this is about one of my favorite sentences of my whole life. I'm like, this is about disillusionment with God. And they're like, what does it sound like to you? I was like, I have no clue what it sounds like to me. And all these musicians are like, yeah, okay. And then they made up disillusionment with God. And I'm like, yeah, buddies, thank you so much. So it's really their contribution. They took the message or the thought process that I had and the feelings that I had for each poem. I told them what the poem I was feeling in my body when I wrote it. And then they just like improv'd it for like what it sounds to them musically. And then we did everything in 1 or 2 takes, and that was it.
It's incredible. There is one, and I'm looking at the album trying to remember what the name of it was, but it's a prayer, right? It starts out the same construct of the prayer that's like, now I lay me down to sleep kind of prayer, but your prayer is for your mom. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Is it Stay by My Side? Is that the one?
Yeah, Stay by My Side. It reminded me, and maybe this is just my interpretation of it, of like a prayer that I said as a little girl, now I lay me down to sleep. And it had that sort of like rhythm of it. But of course, you're praying for your mother to be by your side, for your mother to be consoling you. And it was really, many of them were really powerful. But that one really, really touched my heart a lot, really tender.
Was maybe the third thing I ever wrote is that. And I think it's also because I write to understand. I write to process. And that was me processing, I think, not only losing my mother, not having her, wanting her, hoping that she will be able to help me, but also the idea that I might succumb to the same thing that happened to her.
Yeah.
My betrothed vows to infect and linger. I think, like curse Oedipus, I'll stumble and crawl, bound to my familial inheritance, will it smite us all?
Yes.
It's like me trying to struggle. I was struggling with the fact of, is this going to be what happens to me too? And I don't have the answer for it. And it's me talking to my mom. I think it was the first thing that I ever went, and I went, oh, I'm really proud of this. My mom loves Greek literature. She loves Greek mythologies. And so for me also to have Oedipus and all of these references to Greek mythology is my reference to my mother and what she taught me. And so it's not only a prayer to her, it's a conversation with myself about what might happen to me, and also a prayer that she will come back to me.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel like I had her at that point. And I was just hoping that some way, somehow, one day that will occur.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Well, thank you, Reese. We feel so lucky to have had you on, to have listened to this beautiful album. We will be sure and share with folks where they can listen to the full album as well. And then we do hope that you will let us know when your book comes out. And we'd love to just celebrate that with you when it's finally out. But what a beautiful offering you're making to the world. And it is really raw in the most human way and vulnerable. And I'm glad you feel connected to your grandmother, your mother, and yourself as a writer. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
As we check out, Rebecca, how are you touching into your grief this week?
I feel like I say the same thing every week.
I doubt you do.
Oh, okay. Well, I run a group weekly. So there's that piece. That's the part that I say every week. What I started doing this week is writing. And I used to keep a journal pretty regularly, and then it just didn't speak to me for a while. But I started writing this morning, which is hard to do because it feels like time is so tight in life. And it's like, oh, I have to get all these things done. But something was burning inside of me. I'm like, okay, I'm going to write. And I wasn't sure what I was going to write. I mean, I kind of started writing about the group and just saying because I had closed one group last night. So there's like a sadness and a grief in that. And just, love humans and love when people get together and share their hearts. And so I was writing about that, but then I started to write this idea of, I talk about being a student of grief and having an apprenticeship with sorrow. And I was like, where did that start really? And so I just started writing about when it was sort of the cascade of losses that happened in a year. And I feel like I've told this story so many times. So I was just like, there's nothing new. Even though there are still people who don't know the story, I don't know how to tell it in a way that doesn't just feel like I'm repeating. But when I wrote about it this morning, it felt new. And so, yeah, just kind of being with like the tenderness of the grief of that time period where it was just sort of like back to back losses. So, yeah. How about you, Andrea? How are you touching into your grief?
We are in just a time. We have been podcasting for a year. And in October of last year was when I lost my cousin, like talked to him, and then the next day he was dead. And then within 10 days, lost my grandmother. And then within the next week, lost my Uncle Calvin. And so it was that cascade. And I had kind of lost track of time. And then someone said to me, "Oh, I met you a year ago at this mediumship circle." And I had been not wanting to go because my cousin had just passed away. And I was like, I am carrying so much sadness. My grandmother was sick that I had thought about not going. So I was like, I feel like I'm just going to bombard the space. And I went and she and I met. But then it was this reminder of, oh my God, that means a year ago, all of these things happened. And I got on my computer and up popped the last text message exchange between my cousin and I, which was the day before he passed away. And it was just, I don't know, I've just felt this deep connection to that time a year ago. That was so many things. It was like so sad, but we were doing this podcast and launching this thing into the world. And I felt so surrounded. And people were like, yes, talk about grief. And here I was, like in the depths of grief. And so I don't know, I just feel really kind of in the space of grief and sorrow and loss right now, but not in a way that feels heavy. It just feels like remembrance. That's where I feel. That's where I've been touching into my grief. Reese, how have you been touching into your grief this week?
I've been writing. So writing, I think with October, it's a really special month for me because I lost my mom on Halloween. We're coming up on the 3-year anniversary of it. But my mother loves children. And so what I do is I determined I was going to do this. Not the first year. I couldn't do it the first year, but I couldn't do it the day that she died, but I did it the next year. So the first anniversary. I am a complete menace to society. And I get full-size candy bars from the Costco and I give them out to children in honor of my mom. But here's the menace part. I make them work for it because I know what I have, which is a king-size candy bar on Halloween. So I have all the power in this. And so what I do is I get like these like 4-year-olds come up to me and they're like, hi. And I go, you have 2 options. You can either scare me or act out your character to get the king-size candy bar. And then they have to choose if they want to scare me. And the first year I did it, I'm so glad I did, because one of these kids just like looks me dead in the eyes and he goes like, you forgot to do your taxes this year. And I'm like that's too real. I was like, you get 2 candy bars for that, but that's too. And the other one just goes, yeah, and you left a candle on inside. And I'm like, how do these things? And so, so I look forward to every year I get children to either scare me, which is really difficult with teenagers, talk about pulling teeth,
right?
Or to act out their characters. And it's just so much fun. Yeah, it has a price. So I'm a complete menace and I love doing it. And, so that's, I'm connected with my grief by getting ready to be a complete and total menace to some children.
I love it. I love it. I wish more people made kiddos do tricks or treats, right? Well, thank you again, Reese. We're so glad to have had you on. Have a beautiful week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at allthegriefpod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.